Alright everyone, settle in for tonight's exploration. We're veering off the well-trodden path of heroic sagas, and stepping into something a touch more unvarnished. Prepare for a deep dive, not into the swashbuckling adventures of dashing naval officers, or the glorious victories of Nelson's fleet, but into the grim, often brutal, and relentlessly hard daily existence of a pressed sailor in His Majesty's Royal Navy during the 18th century. That stirring image of tall ships, billowing sails, and Britannia ruling the waves, while the unvarnished truth for the thousands, forcibly snatched from their lives to man those wooden walls, was often a far cry, a floating hell of harsh discipline, rampant disease, and the constant threat of a violent death. And frankly, your modern notions of employment rights and personal liberty would seem an almost alien concept. So find your coziest spot. If you appreciate a journey into the raw, unfiltered past, a like on the video would be fantastic. And do consider subscribing for more of these historical reality checks. As always, I'm curious to know where you're joining us from tonight. Drop a comment with your location and time. It's always a highlight seeing our global community. Okay, perhaps dim those lights, let a soft ambient sound fill the room, and let's embark on tonight's rather sobering journey together. Your life changed in an instant, perhaps in a dockside tavern, or walking home on a darkened street. The thud of a cudgel, rough hands, a canvas bag over your head. This was the work of the press gang. You, a merchant seaman, a fisherman, or even a skilled artisan with no connection to the sea, were now king's men, forcibly recruited to serve the insatiable appetite of the Royal Navy for manpower. There was no appeal, no writ of habeas corpus, that could save you from this legalized kidnapping. Your old life, your family, your trade, all snatched away in a moment of brutal efficiency. Awakening on board the tender, a squalid vessel used to hold pressed men, or directly on the deck of a towering man of war, your first sensations are confusion, fear, and the overpowering stench of unwashed bodies, bilge water, tar, and stale food. You are surrounded by other unwilling recruits, a motley collection of the desperate, the unfortunate, and the simply unlucky. The ship itself is a monstrous, complex wooden world, its towering masts and intricate rigging, a bewildering sight, its creaks and groans, the soundtrack to your new, captive existence. The initial days are a brutal introduction to naval discipline. You are herded, shouted at, and subjected to the whims of petty officers, the boatswain and his mates, whose authority is often enforced with a rope's end or a rattan cane. You learn quickly that disobedience, or even slowness, invites a painful lesson. The language of the sea, a bewildering jargon of nautical terms, must be learned on the fly. Your civilian clothes are likely exchanged for a rough, ill-fitting slop uniform, if anything is provided at all. Your living quarters, if you can call them that, are on the lower decks, a cramped, dark and poorly ventilated space. You sling your hammock, if you are fortunate enough to be issued one, in a tiny sliver of space between cannons, or crammed cheek by jowl with hundreds of other men. Privacy is a forgotten word. The air is thick with the smells of sweat, unwashed linen, and the ever-present dampness. At night, the snores, coughs and groans of your shipmates provide a constant, unwelcome chorus. The diet is monotonous, unappetizing, and often nutritionally deficient. The staples are ship's biscuit, or hardtack, a tooth-breakingly hard flour and water concoction, often infested with weevils. The sailors called them livestock. And salted meat, beef or pork, so heavily preserved it resembles leather, and requires lengthy soaking to be even remotely chewable. Water is stored in wooden casks, and quickly becomes foul. Your daily ration of grog, rum diluted with water, sometimes with lime juice if the captain is enlightened, is often the only palatable, and relatively safe thing to drink. Personal hygiene is a constant struggle. Fresh water for washing is a rare luxury, usually reserved for officers. You might occasionally get a chance to wash your clothes in seawater, or try to catch rainwater. Lice and fleas are your unwelcome bunkmates, thriving in the crowded, unhygienic conditions. The heads, the ship's latrines, are often just open platforms at the bow, exposed to the elements and contributing to the general stench that permeates the vessel. The work of sailing a man of war is relentless, demanding, and incredibly dangerous. You are assigned to a watch, working in shifts around the clock. You might be tasked with hauling on ropes to raise or trim the massive, heavy canvas sails, often in howling gales and freezing spray. Or perhaps you are part of a gun crew, endlessly drilling the complex, brutal ballet of loading and firing the heavy cannons that are the ship's teeth. Every task is performed under the watchful, often unforgiving, eyes of the officer. Working aloft, high on the swaying masts and rigging, is a particularly terrifying prospect for a landsman. You scramble up ratlines, hundreds of feet above the churning sea, to furl or unfurl sails, often in treacherous weather. A missed handhold, a sudden lurch of the ship, can send you plummeting to your death on the deck below, or into the unforgiving ocean. Experienced sailors move with a terrifying agility. For you, it is a constant battle against vertigo and fear. Naval discipline is notoriously harsh, designed to maintain order among a largely unwilling and often unruly crew. The slightest infraction, a moment of insolence, a poorly tied knot, being slow to obey an order, can result in a flogging. The cat o' nine tails, a multi-thonged whip, can strip the flesh from a man's back. Other, even more brutal punishments, exist for more serious offenses. Their very names: keel hauling, running the gauntlet, striking terror into the hearts of the crew. The captain's word is law, his power absolute. Disease is a more constant and often deadlier enemy than the French or Spanish. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin C, rots your gums, loosens your teeth, and causes old wounds to reopen. Typhus, or gall fever, spreads like wildfire in the cramped, unhygienic conditions carried by lice. Dysentery, fevers, and respiratory infections are rampant. The ship's surgeon, often ill-equipped and relying on primitive medical knowledge, can do little for most of these afflictions. The sick bay is a place of profound misery and frequent death. The camaraderie among the lower deck can be a lifeline in this brutal world. You form bonds with your messmates, the small group of men you eat and often work with. You share your meager rations, your rum, your stories, your grievances. This rough fellowship, born of shared suffering and mutual dependence, is often the only source of human comfort and support in an otherwise dehumanizing environment. Nicknames, in-jokes, and a shared cynical humor help to make the unendurable momentarily bearable. Yet, the lower deck is also a place of internal tensions and hierarchies. Experienced prime seamen often look down on landsmen, like yourself. Bullies and thieves exist, preying on the weak or unwary. Disputes over food, gambling debts, or perceived insults can erupt into violence, quickly and brutally suppressed by the petty officers. You learn to navigate this complex social world, to find your place, to avoid trouble. The threat of naval battle looms large in your consciousness. The call to beat to quarters sends a jolt of adrenaline and terror through the ship. You rush to your assigned battle station, perhaps a gun crew, or as a powder monkey, often a boy, carrying cartridges from the magazine, or with a boarding party, armed with a cutlass and pistol. The noise of a broadside, the screams of the wounded, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the splintering of wood as cannonballs tear through the hull. It is an experience of unimaginable horror. Injury in battle is a terrifying prospect. Medical care is rudimentary. The surgeon and his mates work in a dimly lit, blood-soaked cockpit, often deep within the ship. Amputations, performed without anesthetic, are common for shattered limbs, the saw grating on bone, the patient's screams often muffled by a leather strap. Infection is rampant, and many who survive the initial wound succumb later to gangrene or fever. The chances of surviving a serious injury are slim. Life between battles, during long blockades or patrols, can be crushingly monotonous. Days and weeks blur into an endless cycle of watchkeeping, ship maintenance, scrubbing decks, tarring rigging, pumping the bilge, and drills. Boredom is a constant enemy, sometimes leading to mischief, gambling, or illicit brewing of alcohol, all of which risk severe punishment if discovered. You long for any change, any diversion, even if it brings its own dangers. The officers, the captain, lieutenants, and midshipmen, inhabit a different world on the quarterdeck, and in their relatively spacious cabins. They have better food, cleaner conditions, and the power of your interactions with them are usually formal, differential, and fraught with the possibility of offending their dignity or incurring their displeasure. They are a class apart, their concerns and comforts far removed from your own daily struggle for survival. The warrant officers, the boatswain, gunner, carpenter, surgeon, are a bridge between the officers and the crew. They are experienced seamen, responsible for the day-to-day running of their departments, often possessing immense practical skill. Some might be fair and respected, others can be tyrants, abusing their authority over the men under their command. Their favor, or disfavor, can significantly impact your daily life. Shore leave, when it is granted after a long voyage, is a moment of almost delirious relief. The chance to set foot on solid ground, to drink fresh water, to eat fresh food, to escape the confines and discipline of the ship, is eagerly anticipated. But these interludes are often brief and chaotic, spent in dockside taverns and brothels, your meager pay quickly squandered, often ending with you being rounded up by a press gang once more, or returning to the ship diseased or indebted. The vastness and indifference of the ocean become your constant backdrop. You witness its beauty, spectacular sunrises and sunsets, the play of dolphins, the majesty of a whale, but you also experience its terrifying power. Monstrous storms that threaten to tear the ship apart, endless days becalmed under a burning sun with dwindling water supplies, the profound isolation of being a tiny speck in an immense and hostile environment. The sea is both your prison and your universe. News from home, if it ever reaches you, is rare and often months or even years out of date. Letters are a precious, almost sacred, commodity. The longing for family, for loved ones, for the familiar sights and sounds of your former life, can be an agonizing ache, a constant undercurrent of sorrow beneath the harsh surface of your naval existence. Many men never see their homes or families again. The ship itself is a living, breathing entity, its timbers groaning and complaining, its rigging singing in the wind. You learn its every sound, its every motion. It is your shelter and your prison, your workplace, and your potential to. Your survival is inextricably linked to its seaworthiness, to the skill of its officers, and to the collective effort of its crew. You develop a grudging, complex relationship with this wooden beast. The Articles of War, the Naval Code of Discipline, are read aloud periodically, a stark reminder of the brutal penalties for desertion, mutiny, cowardice, or a host of other offenses. The threat of these punishments, and the frequent, ritualized spectacle of floggings, maintain a culture of fear and enforced obedience. Justice is swift, harsh, and entirely at the discretion of the captain and his court-martial. The food supplies often deteriorate over long voyages. The biscuit becomes riddled with weevils, the salted meat rancid, the water putrid. You learn to eat in the dark to avoid seeing what you are consuming, to bang your biscuit on the table to dislodge the insect. Hunger and malnutrition are constant companions, weakening your body and making you more susceptible to disease. The petty officers, the boatswain's mates and quartermasters, are the NCOs of the naval world, directly responsible for supervising your work and enforcing discipline. Some are experienced, fair-minded seamen, others are bullies and tyrants, enjoying their small measure of power over the pressed men and lower-rated sailors. Your daily comfort, or lack thereof, often depends on the character of these immediate superiors. The smell of tar is pervasive, a signature scent of the wooden warship. It is used to waterproof the hull, the decks, the rigging. It gets on your clothes, your hands and your hair. Combined with the odors of bilge water, unwashed bodies, stale food and gunpowder, it creates an olfactory environment that is uniquely and unpleasantly naval. You carry this smell with you, a constant reminder of your servitude. Superstitions are rife among the crew. Sailors believe in omens, lucky charms and rituals, to ward off bad luck, or ensure a safe voyage. Whistling is often forbidden, as it is believed to summon a storm. Certain days are considered unlucky for setting sail. These beliefs, born of a life lived at the mercy of unpredictable forces, provide a small illusion of control or understanding in a chaotic world. The ship's surgeon, though often lacking effective remedies, does his best with the tools and knowledge available. He might prescribe mercury for venereal diseases, cinchona bark for fevers, or perform crude surgery for injuries. His domain, the sickbay or cockpit, during battle, is a place of horror, yet also sometimes the only place where a modicum of care, however inadequate, is offered. The division of the crew into watches, starboard and larboard, means you are part of a team, responsible for sailing and fighting the ship for a set period, then theoretically resting while the other watch is on duty. However, in emergencies, or when all hands are called, everyone is roused, regardless of their watch. True rest is a rare commodity. The guns themselves are objects of both pride and terror. Each cannon is a heavy, cumbersome beast, requiring a team of up to a dozen men to load, aim and fire. The recoil is tremendous, the noise deafening. During battle, the gun deck is a scene of frantic, coordinated labor, smoke, and a high probability of horrific injury from enemy shot or flying splinters. Your life depends on the efficient service of these iron monsters. The possibility of desertion is a constant temptation for many pressed men, but the risks are enormous. If caught, the punishment is almost invariably a brutal flogging, or even death. Ports are heavily guarded, and informers are common. Yet some men, driven to desperation by the harsh conditions, still attempt it, dreaming of a return to freedom however slim the chance. The sheer noise of life aboard a crowded man of war is inescapable. The creaking of the ship's timbers, the slap of waves against the hull, the shouts of orders, the tramp of feet on the deck above, the clang of the ship's bell marking the watches, the conversations and arguments of hundreds of men in a confined space. Silence is a forgotten luxury. The ship's carpenters and sailmakers are vital to its survival. They work constantly to repair damage from storms, battles or simple wear and tear. The carpenter and his mates patch shot holes, strengthen weakened masts, and keep the pumps working. The sailmaker and his crew stitch and mend the vast expanses of canvas that propel the ship. Their skill is essential to keeping the wooden world afloat and moving. The distinctions between a volunteer and a pressed man often blur over time, as both share the same hardships, dangers and discipline. However, the initial injustice of impressment, the feeling of having been stolen from your life, can leave a lasting bitterness, a deep-seated resentment against the system that holds you captive. This sense of wrongness fuels a quiet, often unspoken desire for escape or an end to your service. The allocation of prize money, after the capture of an enemy vessel, is a rare source of excitement and potential wealth, though the lion's share always goes to the captain and officer.
For the common sailor, even a small share can seem like a fortune, offering a fleeting dream of paying off debts or sending money home, but such windfalls are infrequent, and often quickly dissipated. The concept of patriotism is a complex one for oppressed man. You are forced to fight for a king and country that has in effect enslaved you. Yet, in the heat of battle, a sense of shared purpose, of defending your shipmates, can emerge. Survival often depends on fighting effectively, regardless of your personal feelings about the cause. Your loyalty is primarily to your fellow sufferers. The monotony of long sea voyages, with no land in sight for weeks or months, can be mentally corrosive. The same endless horizon, the same cramped quarters, the same tasteless food, the same demanding routine. This can lead to a state of profound ennui, or calenture, a delirium, where sailors imagine the sea to be green fields and try to leap overboard. The ship's cooks, often one-legged veterans, or men otherwise unfit for heavy labor, struggle to prepare palatable meals from the poor quality ingredients in the cramped, smoky galley. Their efforts are rarely appreciated, and the food is a constant source of complaint and grim humor among the crew. God sends meat, and the devil sends cooks, is a common naval saying. The purser, responsible for the ship's stores and accounts, is often a figure of suspicion, accused of shortchanging the men on their rations, or selling inferior goods for his own profit. His complex system of bookkeeping, with its myriad deductions and allowances, is incomprehensible to most sailors, fueling a sense of being cheated. The rare moments of calm weather, when the ship glides smoothly over a gentle sea, can offer a brief respite from the usual hardship. Men might take the opportunity to mend their clothes, write letters, if they are literate, and have materials, or simply sit on deck and watch the ocean, lost in their own thoughts, dreaming of home. These quiet interludes are precious. The petty jealousies and rivalries between different parts of the ship's company, between foretopmen and maintopmen, between gun crews, between different watches, can sometimes lead to friction or fight. But these are usually overshadowed by the larger, shared antagonism towards the officers and the system that binds them all. The practice of crossing the line, a rough and often brutal initiation ceremony for sailors crossing the equator for the first time, is a tradition upheld by the older hand. It involves being shaved with a rusty hoop, dunked in water, and subjected to other indignities, all in the name of King Neptune. For oppressed men, it is yet another layer of unwanted experience. The articles of war being read aloud, detailing the myriad offenses and their brutal punishments, serves as a constant reminder of the precariousness of your existence. Even an accidental infraction could lead to a flogging that could cripple or kill. You live under a system of terror, where discipline is maintained through the omnipresent threat of agonizing pain. The cramped space means that infectious diseases, once they take hold, can sweep through the ship with terrifying speed. A single sick man can quickly infect his entire mess, and then the entire deck. The surgeon has few effective means of quarantine or cure. You watch your shipmates sicken and die, knowing you could be next. The ship's chaplain, if one is aboard, might also serve as the schoolmaster for the midshipmen and any boys on board. For the common sailor, however, access to education is non-existent. Literacy is rare among the lower deck, and your world is largely one of oral tradition, shouted orders, and the hard-learned lessons of survival. The longing for fresh food, fruits, vegetables, fresh meat, clean water, becomes an obsession. You dream of it, talk about it. The first sight of land after a long voyage often means the promise of these simple, life-sustaining things, a temporary escape from the tyranny of salt pork and weevil-ridden biscuit. The constant dampness below decks, from leaks, spray, and the breath of hundreds of men, means that your clothes and bedding are almost never truly dry. This contributes to chills, respiratory illnesses, and a general sense of discomfort and misery. Mold and mildew are your constant companion. The end of a commission, or the paying off of a ship, does not necessarily mean freedom for oppressed man. You might be immediately transferred to another vessel, or if set ashore, be at risk of being snatched by another press gang, almost immediately. True release from the king's service is a rare and often distant prospect. The sound of the boatswain's pipe, or call, is a shrill, distinctive sound that governs your every action. It signals the changing of the watch, the call to meals, the summons to all hands, or the dreaded order to witness punishment. Its piercing notes are an inescapable part of the auditory landscape of your naval prison. The romance of the sea, so often celebrated in song and story, is a bitter, hollow mockery to you. Your reality is one of unceasing labor, brutal discipline, constant danger, and profound unfreedom. You are a cog in a vast wooden war machine, your individual life and suffering of little consequence to the grand ambitions of empires. This is the unvarnished truth of your existence, chained to the tide.
The world of the Mexico was one of sharp contrasts, of exquisite beauty, built upon a foundation of relentless dread. At its heart lay the city of Tenochtitlan, a marvel of engineering and will, floating upon the waters of Lake Texcoco. Its causeways were arteries of tribute, its markets a symphony of 100 languages, its temples pyramids of stone that clawed at the heavens. From the summit of the Templo Mayor, the great temple, the empire seemed eternal, commanded by a man who was more than a king. He was the Hui Tlatoani, the great speaker, Moctezuma II, the avatar of a god on earth. Yet, in the years leading up to the Christian year of 1519, a shadow had fallen over Moctezuma's spirit. A series of omens, dark and inexplicable, had unsettled the rhythm of the cosmos. A pillar of fire had appeared in the eastern sky, bleeding light across the horizon until dawn. The temple of the war god Huitzilopochtli had burst into flames for no reason, its wooden heart consumed by a fire that water could not quench. Fishermen had brought the emperor a strange bird, a crane with a mirror set into its head. When Moctezuma looked into the mirror, he saw not his own reflection, but a vision of armed men riding upon creatures like giant deer, coming from the east. The priests could offer no comfort, their divinations clouded and fearful. The empire held its breath, waiting for a prophecy to unfold, the foretold return of the feathered serpent god, Quetzalcoatl, who had promised to come from the east in the year of Secatl, the year 1 Re. It was in that very year that the mountains began to float upon the sea. From the coast, runners brought panicked reports of vessels larger than any canoe, with white wings that caught the wind. From these floating towers came men with skin the color of ash, with hair on their faces like corn silk, and with weapons that spoke in thunder and spat fire. They were led by a man of medium height but immense presence, a man whose eyes burned with a cold fire of ambition that the Mexica could not comprehend. His name was Hernan Cortés was a man forged in the crucible of the Spanish Reconquista, a minor nobleman from the arid lands of Extremadura, who had come to the New World seeking the fortune that was denied to him in the Old. He was 34 years old, charismatic, cunning, and utterly ruthless. He had defied the governor of Cuba to launch this expedition, investing his own wealth and sinking himself into debt for a chance at glory and gold. His force was laughably small for the task of conquering a continent, just over 500 soldiers, 16 horses, a handful of small cannons, and a pack of war dogs. But he possessed two assets more valuable than any weapon: an unshakable belief in his own destiny, and a profound understanding of human weakness. Landing on the coast of Veracruz, Cortés made his first critical decision. He established a town, La Villa Rica de la Veracruz, and in doing so, created a legal fiction. By establishing a municipality, he could place himself directly under the authority of King Charles of Spain, bypassing the enraged governor of Cuba, who had ordered his arrest. His next act was even more audacious. After quelling a mutiny among men who wished to return to the safety of Cuba, he gave a secret order. Under the cover of night, his most loyal men bored holes in the hulls of their own ships. The fleet, their only means of escape, was scuttled. Before his assembled army, Cortés presented the act as a necessity, their vessels being no longer seaworthy. The message was clear and terrifying. There was no retreat, their only path was forward, to Tenochtitlan or to their grave. Moctezuma reacted to the news with a mixture of fear and imperial arrogance. He sent emissaries bearing magnificent gifts, hoping to placate the strangers and persuade them to leave. The gifts were masterpieces of Aztec artistry, intricate featherwork, turquoise masks, and two great discs, one of gold representing the sun and one of silver representing the moon, each as large as a cartwheel. He could not have made a more catastrophic miscalculation. For the Spanish, these gifts were not a deterrent, they were proof. The legends were true. There was a kingdom of unimaginable wealth in the interior, and Cortés would have it. The march inland was a journey into another world. The Spaniards moved through dense jungles and over freezing mountain passes, their steel armor a stark contrast to the vibrant, alien landscape. They soon learned that the Aztec Empire was not a monolithic entity, but a tapestry of conquered peoples held together by force and fear, simmering with resentment over the constant demand for tribute and sacrificial victims. In the city-state of Tlaxcala, they met their first serious resistance. The Tlaxcalans were fierce warriors, traditional enemies of the Mexica, who saw the Spanish not as gods, but as invaders. For weeks, they threw themselves at the small Spanish force. The battles were brutal. The Spanish steel, cannons, and cavalry, terrifying and effective, were nearly overwhelmed by sheer numbers. But Cortés survived. He survived through superior tactics and the terror his weapons inspired. And after defeating them, he did something remarkable. He offered them peace. He offered them an alliance against their hated enemy, the Mexica. The Tlaxcalan elders, seeing a chance to finally destroy their oppressors, agreed.
Thousands of their finest warriors joined the Spanish ranks. It was the single most important moment of the campaign. Cortés now had the manpower to challenge an empire. He was no longer just the leader of a small band of adventurers. He was the commander of an indigenous army of rebellion. With his new allies, Cortés marched on Cholula, a city sacred to Quetzalcoatl and loyal to Moctezuma. Here his native interpreter and consort, a woman known as La Malinche, uncovered a plot to ambush and massacre the Spanish. Cortés decided on a preemptive strike of horrific brutality. Luring the city's nobles and priests into a central square, he unleashed his men and his Tlaxcalan allies. Thousands of unarmed Cholulans were slaughtered in a matter of hours. The message to the rest of the empire was unambiguous. Resistance would be met with annihilation. News of the massacre reached Tenochtitlan, and the fear that had been simmering in Moctezuma's heart turned to ice. He saw no alternative but to welcome the strangers into his city. In November of 1519, the Spanish and their allies crossed the Great Southern Causeway into Tenochtitlan. What they saw stunned them into silence. The soldiers, rough men from the hard-scrabble villages of Spain, gaped at a city that seemed plucked from the pages of a fantasy. It was larger and cleaner than any city in Europe. Towers and temples rose from the water, connected by broad, straight roads. Canals teemed with canoes, and floating gardens, the chinampas, produced an abundance of food. The marketplace at Tlatelolco was a dizzying spectacle of 60,000 people buying and selling everything from gold and jaguar pelts to vanilla and slate. It was, as one soldier, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, would later write, like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Amadis. Some even wondered if they were dreaming. At the entrance to the city, the two worlds finally met. Hernán Cortés, clad in steel, dismounted from his horse. Moctezuma, the great speaker, emerged from a litter carried by his highest nobles, who swept the ground before him. He was about 40 years old, tall and slender, adorned in a cloak of brilliant blue feathers and wearing sandals with soles of pure gold. Their meeting was a masterpiece of tense diplomacy. Through La Malinche they exchanged greetings. Cortés attempted to embrace the emperor, an act of familiarity that shocked the Aztec nobles, as no one was permitted to touch their divine ruler. Moctezuma led the Spaniards to a palace in the heart of the city, a spacious compound that could house them all. They were to be his honored guests. For a week, an uneasy peace prevailed. The Spanish wandered the city in a state of awe and deep-seated fear. They were mesmerized by the civilization's sophistication, but horrified by its religion. Atop the Templo Mayor, they saw the sacrificial stones, stained black with dried blood, and the priests, with their hair matted with gore. They saw racks holding thousands of human skulls. In their minds, this magnificent city was a fortress of Satan, its people in desperate need of salvation, its gold a righteous prize to be taken for the Christian king. Cortés knew his position was precarious. He and his men were on an island, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of warriors, who could annihilate them at any moment. He needed leverage. With breathtaking audacity, he resolved to seize the emperor himself. Under the pretext of an attack on his coastal garrison by one of Moctezuma's vassals, Cortés and a small group of his captains marched to the emperor's palace, fully armed. After a tense confrontation, they compelled Moctezuma to accompany them back to the Spanish court. He would not be a prisoner, they claimed, but would merely be relocating his court as a sign of his trust. It was a coup. Moctezuma, for reasons still debated by historians, whether from fear, religious fatalism, or a strategic attempt to understand his captors, from that moment on, he was a puppet ruler. He governed his empire from his gilded cage, issuing orders on behalf of the Spanish, calming his restless nobles, and directing a steady stream of gold into the hands of his captors. This fragile state of affairs was shattered by news from the coast. A large Spanish force, led by Pamphilo de Narvaez, had arrived with orders from the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for insubordination, leaving his trusted but hot-headed lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge of Tenochtitlan. Cortés took a portion of his men and marched to the coast. In a daring night attack, he defeated the larger force of Narvaez, and through a combination of bribes and promises of immense wealth, convinced most of his former enemies to join him. He returned to Tenochtitlan a victor, his army now tripled in size. But he returned to a city on the brink of explosion. In his absence, Alvarado had made a disastrous error. Fearing an uprising during the great festival of Toxcat, he had ordered his soldiers to attack the unarmed Aztec nobles and priests, as they danced in the ceremonial court. It was a senseless massacre, a betrayal that extinguished any lingering respect the Mexica had for their guests. When Cortés entered the city, he found his men besieged in their palace, the streets silent and hostile. The city was a trap about to spring. The fury of the Aztecs, suppressed for so long, was finally unleashed. Tens of thousands of warriors swarmed the Spanish compound, raining stones, arrows, and spears. Cortés forced the captive Moctezuma to go to the rooftop, to speak to his people, to command them to lay down their arms. But the people no longer saw him as their great speaker. They saw him as a traitor. A volley of stones and arrows flew towards the emperor. One large stone struck him on the head. A few days later, Moctezuma died, either from his wounds or, as some Spanish sources claimed, from a broken heart, refusing all food and aid. With the emperor dead, the Spanish position was untenable. Their food and water were gone, their gunpowder. Their only choice was to attempt a desperate escape under the cover of darkness. The night of June 30, 1520, would forever be known to the Spanish as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrow. They planned to sneak out along the western causeway, using a portable wooden bridge to cross the gaps the Aztecs had opened in the road. They muffled their horses' hooves, and moved out into a drizzling rain. But they were spotted. A woman drawing water saw them and screamed an alarm. The sound of conch shell trumpets and war drums suddenly filled the night. The lake, which had been silent moments before, erupted with war canoes. Aztec warriors swarmed the causeway, attacking from the front, the rear, and the water. The escape dissolved into a blind, panicked slaughter. The portable bridge became stuck. The narrow causeway became a bottleneck of death. Soldiers, weighed down by the gold they had stuffed into their armor, fell into the lake and drowned. Horses slipped and screamed, dragging their riders down with them. The gaps in the causeway were filled with the bodies of men and animals, with cannons and treasure chests. Cortés, who had managed to cross to the mainland with his vanguard, turned back to see the carnage. He watched as his friends and comrades were cut down or captured, knowing they would be dragged to the top of the Templo Mayor to have their hearts cut out at dawn. He was said to have sat beneath a great tree and wept. He had lost more than half his Spanish soldiers, thousands of his Tlaxcalan allies, and all his cannons and treasure. It was a catastrophic defeat. Any lesser man would have surrendered. But Cortés was not a lesser man. Wounded and pursued, he led the ragged survivors on a grueling retreat towards the safety of Tlaxcala. The Aztecs, led by a new aggressive emperor Cuitlahuac, harried them relentlessly. At the plains of Otumba, the remnants of the Spanish force made a final desperate stand against a vast Aztec army. In a suicidal charge, Cortés and a few of his horsemen fought their way directly to the Aztec commander, killing him and capturing his battle standard. The Aztec army, leaderless and shocked by the audacity of the charge, faltered and then broke. The Spanish were saved. They limped back to Tlaxcala, expecting to be killed by their allies. But the Tlaxcalans remained loyal. Their hatred for the Mexica was greater than their disappointment in the Spanish defeat. And here, as the Spanish slowly recovered their strength, and Cortés planned his revenge, a new and terrible ally arrived. It came not in a ship, but in the breath of one of Narvaez's soldiers, an African slave who had been infected with smallpox. The disease, unknown in the Americas, swept through the native population with the speed and lethality of a wildfire. People died by the thousands, their bodies covered in pustules, with no immunity and no understanding of the contagion. It killed the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, and decimated the ranks of the Aztec warriors. While the Spanish were largely immune, Tenochtitlan became a charnel house. By the spring of 1521, Cortés was ready. His army was reinforced with new arrivals from Cuba, and tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan and other native allies flocked to his banner. His plan for the final conquest was methodical and brutal. He would not just storm the city, he would strangle it. In one of the most remarkable logistical feats in military history, he ordered the construction of a fleet of 13 small prefabricated warships, called brigantines. These were built in Tlaxcala, then carried in pieces by thousands of porters over the mountains to Lake Texcoco, where they were reassembled. The siege began. The brigantines, armed with cannons, gave Cortés control of the lake. They defeated the Aztec war canoes, and blockaded the causeways, cutting off all food and fresh water from the city. The final Aztec emperor, a young and heroic man named Cuauhtemoc, refused to surrender. For 80 days, the city endured a living hell. Starvation and thirst were rampant. The Spanish and their allies launched relentless attacks, slowly advancing down the causeways and into the city streets. The fighting was savage, a street by street, house by house battle for a dying city. The Aztecs fought with the courage of despair, but they could not stop the inevitable. Cortés, seeing the battle would destroy the city he had so admired, ordered it to be systematically leveled as his troops advanced. The temples were burned, the palaces torn down, the canals filled with the rubble of a fallen civilization. On August 13, Cuauhtemoc, attempting to escape by canoe, was captured. With his surrender, all resistance ceased. The Spanish entered what was left of Tenochtitlan. It was a landscape of death. The canals were clogged with bodies, the air thick with the stench of decay. The once proud city on the lake was a smoking ruin. The Aztec Empire, a civilization that had commanded millions, had been brought down by a few hundred Spaniards, their native allies, their unshakable resolve, and the silent devastation of disease. A new world, the world of New Spain, would be built upon its ashes, but the ghost of the city on the lake, and the memory of the tragic, violent collision of two worlds, would linger forever.
The world remade by the First Crusade was a place of fierce piety and brutal peril. Jerusalem had been won, wrested from Muslim control in a storm of righteous violence, and the pathways to its holy sites were now open to the faithful of Christendom. Yet these paths were not safe. They snaked through hostile territory, haunted by brigands and predators who saw the devout pilgrims not as souls seeking salvation, but as defenseless prey. To journey to the Holy Land was to undertake an act of faith that could very well end in martyrdom, long before one reached the sacred city. In the year 1119, in the newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem, a French knight from the region of Champagne considered this grim reality. His name was Hugues de Payens, a man of noble birth but modest means, a veteran of the crusade who had stayed behind. He saw the suffering of the pilgrims and was moved by a purpose that was both practical and divine. He gathered around him 8 other knights, men like himself, bound by shared experience and a common vow. Before the Patriarch of Jerusalem in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself, this small brotherhood made a solemn promise. They would live as monks, embracing vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But unlike other monastic orders, their work would not be confined to the cloister. They would take up the sword to defend the roads, to be the guardians of the weak. They called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Christ. King Baldwin II of Jerusalem, desperate for capable men to defend his precarious kingdom, granted them a headquarters. It was a wing of his own palace, a building that stood upon the holiest ground in the city, the Temple Mount believed to be the site of the ancient Temple of Solomon. From this location they would gain the name that would echo through history, the Knights of the Temple, or simply, the Temple. Their beginnings were humble, almost pitifully so. For the first 9 years they accepted no new recruits, their numbers remaining fixed at 9. They were so poor, legend holds, that Hugues de Payens and his co-founder, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, had to share a single horse, an image of fraternal poverty that would be immortalized on their seal. They wore discarded clothes and relied on donations for their daily bread. They were a curiosity, a small band of pious warriors in a land full of them, their future as uncertain as the next desert skirmish. To most they were a noble but hopeless cause, destined to fade into obscurity. But Hugues de Payens had a vision that stretched far beyond the dusty roads of Judea. He knew that for the order to survive, it needed the one thing it did not possess: the official sanction of the Church and the support of Europe. In 1127, he traveled back to France with a singular mission: to win the backing of the most powerful man in Christendom. Not the Pope, nor any king, but a Cistercian abbot from Clairvaux. His name was Bernard, a man whose gaunt frame and simple robes belied a will of iron, and an intellect that could shape the soul of a continent. Bernard of Clairvaux was a theological superstar, a kingmaker and a spiritual guide whose influence was unparalleled. Hugues de Payens pleaded his case, and in the idea of the Templars Bernard saw the perfect fusion of his two great passions, monastic devotion, and the defense of the faith. He saw the potential for a new kind of man, a warrior monk who could wield a sword with the same purity of heart as another might hold a rosary. He became their champion, their advocate, and their architect. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, it was Bernard's electrifying influence that led the assembled bishops and nobles to formally recognize the Knights Templar as a new religious order. Bernard did more. He wrote a treatise, De la Nouvelle Militia, in praise of the new knighthood. This was not just a document, it was a masterpiece of propaganda. In soaring prose, he contrasted the vain, worldly knights of Europe with the selfless Templars. A secular knight, he wrote, killed for pride and plunder, damning his own soul. But a Knight Templar was a knight of Christ. When he killed an evildoer, it was not homicide, but malicide, the killing of evil itself. He was an instrument of God, and if he fell in battle, he was a blessed martyr. This powerful idea legitimized holy violence in a way that had never been articulated before. It made the Templars not just acceptable, but aspirational. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Donations began to pour in from every corner of Europe. Kings and queens, powerful nobles, wealthy merchants,
and humble farmers bequeathed them land, castles, farms, mills and vast sums of money. A flood of new recruits, from the highest echelons of the nobility, clamored to join their ranks. In a few short years, the Order of the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ became one of the wealthiest landowners in the Western world. They were granted an unprecedented series of papal bulls that placed them outside all authority save that of the Pope himself. They were exempt from taxes, free to cross any border, and answered to no king, no prince, and no bishop. They had become a state within a state, a supranational corporation, whose loyalty was to God and their Grand Master alone. Their public image was one of austerity and piety, symbolized by their white mantles, adorned with a simple red cross. Their internal discipline was severe, governed by a Latin rule that dictated every aspect of their lives, from prayer to the maintenance of their equipment. They were forbidden from gambling, hunting and any form of ostentatious decoration. But this monastic exterior housed a core of the most elite and feared warriors of the age. In the Holy Land, the Templars became the backbone of the Crusader state's defense. They were always placed in the position of greatest danger, holding the vanguard on the march, and the rear guard in retreat. They garrisoned key castles, massive fortresses like Castelblanc and Tortosa, which anchored the fragile Christian frontier. Their discipline on the battlefield was legendary. While secular armies often broke ranks in a chaotic charge, the Templars fought as a single cohesive unit, waiting for the precise moment to unleash their devastating cavalry charge. At the Battle of Montgisard in 1107, their reputation was forged in blood and victory. A massive army led by the great Muslim Sultan, Saladin, had invaded the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Christian force was hopelessly outnumbered, led by a 16-year-old king, afflicted with leprosy. Defeat seemed certain, but a contingent of around 80 Knights Templar, joined by a few hundred other knights, led a desperate charge directly at Saladin's personal bodyguard. The sheer ferocity and discipline of the Templar attack shattered the confidence of the larger army, which broke and fled. It was a miraculous victory against impossible odds. But their story was not one of unbroken success. They suffered catastrophic defeats as well. At the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, in 1187, a disaster that led to the fall of Jerusalem, the Templar contingent was all but wiped out, fighting to the last man. After the battle, Saladin offered the captured Templars a choice: convert to Islam or die. To a man they chose martyrdom, and were beheaded. Their unwavering commitment, in victory and defeat, only added to their mystique. While their warriors fought on the frontier, the rest of the order, the vast majority of its members, were engaged in a different kind of enterprise back in Europe. They managed their sprawling agricultural estates with remarkable efficiency, producing wine, wool and grain. And it was here that they developed their most lasting innovation. They became the world's first international bankers. The system they created was born of necessity. A pilgrim or a crusader traveling from London to Jerusalem faced the constant risk of being robbed of the fortune needed to fund their journey. The Templars offered a solution. The traveler could deposit his gold at the London Temple, a large complex on the banks of the Thames. In return, he would receive a letter of credit, a piece of parchment with a coded inscription. He could then travel the length of Europe and the Mediterranean, staying at Templar preceptories along the way. Upon arrival in the Holy Land, he would present his letter at the Templar headquarters, and his funds would be made available to him. It was a revolutionary system of secure money transfer, built on the order's unimpeachable reputation for integrity and its vast, secure network of fortified houses. They charged for this service, and soon they were not just transferring money, but lending it to merchants, to nobles and even to kings. The Paris Temple became the financial hub of Europe, a repository for the royal treasuries of France and England. The warrior monks had become financiers of immense and unprecedented power. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars were an institution woven into the very fabric of Christendom. But the world was changing. The crusading ideal was fading, and one by one, the Christian strongholds in the Holy Land fell. The end came in 1291, with the fall of Acre, the last Crusader capital. The Templars fought valiantly in the city's defense, their Grand Master being killed in the final desperate battles. The survivors retreated to their island fortress on Cyprus, their original purpose now gone. The Knights of the Temple were warriors without a war, guardians without a Holy Land to guard. They remained, however, incredibly wealthy and powerful, with their nerve center now effectively in Paris. And it was there, in the heart of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, that they would meet their doom. The King of France was Philip IV, a man known as Le Bel, the Fair, for his handsome features, not his character. Philip was a new breed of monarch. He was intensely pious, yet possessed a cold, ruthless ambition to create a centralized French state, with himself as its absolute, unquestioned ruler. His treasury was empty, depleted by constant wars with England and Flanders. His eyes fell upon the vast untaxed wealth of the Knights Templar. More than their wealth, Philip resented their power. The Templars were a law unto themselves, an international order that did not bend to his will. They were an intolerable affront to his vision of absolute monarchy. With his chief minister, the cunning and unscrupulous lawyer, Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip began to orchestrate a secret and devastating plot. He would not just seize their wealth, he would destroy the order itself, utterly and completely. The weapon they chose was heresy. It was the one charge that could bring down an order protected by the Pope. Working in secret, Nogaret's agents began collecting testimony from disgruntled or expelled Templars, men willing to slander the order for money or revenge. A list of shocking accusations was compiled. The Templars, it was claimed, were not true Christians at all. New recruits during their secret initiation ceremonies were forced to deny Jesus Christ, to spit upon the crucifix, and to engage in obscene kisses. They were accused of institutionalized homosexuality, and of worshipping a demonic idol, a mysterious bearded head known as Baphomet. The charges were a grotesque caricature, a blend of heretical tropes and pure invention, designed to inspire maximum public horror. The Grand Master of the order at the time was Jacques de Molay, an elderly man, a veteran of the wars in the East, but not a sophisticated political player. He was aware of some rumors circulating about the order, but did not grasp the mortal danger he was in. 1307 he was summoned to France by Pope Clement V, ostensibly to discuss plans for a new crusade. He walked directly into Philip's trap, in the pre-dawn hours of Friday, October 13. In a stunningly coordinated military operation, Philip's agents simultaneously arrested every Knight Templar in France. Jacques de Molay was seized in the Paris temple itself. The knights were caught completely by surprise. They offered no resistance. They were chained and thrown into dungeons, their property and land seized by the crown. The date would live on in infamy, forever associated with bad luck. What followed was a campaign of systematic terror. The arrested knights were handed over to royal inquisitors, masters of torture. Using the rack, strappado, and burning coals, they were subjected to unimaginable agony to force a confession. Under such duress, human endurance has its limits. Many knights, broken in body and spirit, confessed to anything their tormentors wanted to hear. They admitted to spitting on the cross, to worshipping the idol, to all the bizarre and blasphemous charges leveled against them. Jacques de Molay himself, after days of interrogation, confessed to some of the charges, a catastrophic blow to the order's defense. Pope Clement V, a Frenchman who owed his papacy to Philip's influence, was initially outraged by the king's high-handed actions, but when presented with a flood of confessions, including that of the Grand Master, he issued a papal bull ordering all the monarchs of Christendom to arrest the Templars in their own lands, and initiated a series of papal hearings to determine the order's guilt. The trials were a tragic farce. For a brief period the Templars found their courage. In Paris, hundreds of knights, when questioned by papal commissioners, without the immediate presence of royal torturers, recanted their confessions. They spoke of the agony they had endured, showing the marks of the torture on their body. They proclaimed the innocence of the order and their loyalty to the church. It was a moment of heroic defiance, but it was futile. Philip was in control. He declared that any Templar who retracted his confession was a relapsed heretic. In May 1310, 54 Knights Templar were burned at the stake in a field outside Paris, for the crime of withdrawing their confessions. The message was clear: silence or fire. The defense collapsed. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, the fate of the order was. Even then the assembled bishops were not convinced of the order's guilt, but Philip, present with his army, pressured the Pope relentlessly. Clement, unwilling to convict them but too weak to exonerate them, chose a middle path. He officially dissolved the order, not because of a guilty verdict, but on the grounds that its reputation was so tarnished that it could no longer serve its purpose. Its immense properties were to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller, though Philip's crown managed to keep a vast portion. The final act of the tragedy played out 2 years later. On March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay and another Templar leader, Geoffrey de Charny, were led onto a scaffold erected in front of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. They were to publicly reaffirm their confessions and be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. But the old Grand Master had one last act of defiance left in him. As he stood before the crowd, he found his voice, not the broken whisper of a tortured prisoner, but the clear, defiant roar of a knight. He proclaimed his innocence and the innocence of his order. He declared that he was guilty only of the shame of lying to save his own life. The charges were fictitious, he said, and the order was holy and just. Geoffrey de Charny shouted his agreement. The crowd was stunned. King Philip, who was present, was incandescent with rage. There would be no lengthy trial for this relapse. He ordered that they be executed that very evening. On a small island in the river Seine, 2 pyres were hastily constructed. As the flames licked at his feet, Jacques de Molay is said to have uttered a final terrible curse. From the fire he summoned his accusers to meet him before the judgment seat of God. He gave Pope Clement 40 days, and King Philip a year. The curse, whether real or a later invention, was eerily fulfilled. Pope Clement V died of a wasting disease just over a month later. King Philip the Fair, still in his prime, suffered a stroke while hunting and died within the year. The fall of the Knights Templar was complete. Their wealth was gone, their members scattered or dead, their name erased, but their legend had just begun. The mystery of their downfall, the rumors of a lost treasure, and the specter of their secret rituals, would feed conspiracy theories for centuries, ensuring that the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon would never truly be forgotten.
In the spring of 1845, the River Thames was alive with the confident hum of an empire at its zenith. Great Britain was the workshop of the world, its navy the undisputed master of the seas, its ambitions as vast as the territories colored red on the global map. From a dockyard in Greenhithe, 2 ships made their final preparations, the very embodiment of this national self-assurance. They were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, veteran polar vessels, now refitted to be the most advanced tools of exploration ever conceived. Their bows were sheathed in iron to smash through ice. Their hulls were reinforced with massive timbers, and deep within their bowels, modified steam locomotives were connected to propellers, allowing them to push through calm or contrary winds. They were vessels designed to conquer the last great geographic prize on the planet, the Northwest Passage. For centuries this fabled sea route through the Arctic archipelago, a potential shortcut to the riches of Asia, had haunted the European imagination, claiming the lives and ships of countless explorers. Now the British Admiralty believed its final charting was at hand. Only a small unknown section remained. The man chosen to lead this grand endeavor was Sir John Franklin. At 59, he was a seasoned naval officer and a respected if somewhat staid veteran of Arctic travel. He was not, perhaps, the most dynamic choice, but he was a safe one, a figure of steady authority. He was to command a hand-picked crew of 228 officers and men, the best the Royal Navy had to offer. They were provisioned for a journey of 3 years, supplied with every conceivable comfort and necessity. The holds were crammed with over 80,000 pounds of salted beef and pork, thousands of gallons of concentrated soup, and a library of 1,200 books. Most modern of all were 8,000 hermetically sealed tins of preserved meats, vegetables and soups, a technological marvel intended to keep scurvy and starvation at bay. On May 19, 1845, with flags flying and crowds cheering, the Erebus and Terror weighed anchor and sailed into the promise of history. In late July, the ships were sighted for the last time by a whaling vessel in Baffin Bay, near the entrance to Lancaster Sound. The officers were in high spirits, dining with the whaler's captain, confident they would complete their passage within a year. They waited for favorable conditions to break through the ice barrier and enter the labyrinth of islands. Then they sailed west, into the white haze of the Arctic summer, and vanished. The first year passed without word, which was not unexpected. Arctic exploration was a slow and patient business, dictated by the seasonal freeze and thaw of the ice. The second year came and went, and the silence from the north began to deepen. At the Admiralty in London, a quiet unease began to stir. By 1848, the unease had blossomed into full-blown public anxiety. The nation's heroes, its 2 finest polar ships, were missing. At the heart of this growing storm was a woman of formidable intellect and unbending will, Lady Jane Franklin. She was not the sort of woman to sit idly by and weep. Well-traveled, intelligent, and politically connected, she began a relentless campaign of letters, petitions, and personal lobbying. She pressured the Admiralty, she appealed to the public, and when official efforts seemed to stall, she used her own fortune and solicited private donations to fund her own search expeditions. She would not allow her husband and his men to be abandoned to the ice. The search for the Franklin expedition began, an epic undertaking that would in its own right become one of the greatest sagas of Arctic exploration. Over the next decade, more than 30 expeditions sailed for the Arctic, an international effort involving British, American, and French crews. They were hunting for any trace, any clue to the fate of 1,209 men. These searchers, in their quest for the lost, ended up mapping more of the Canadian Arctic than had ever been known. They endured the same hardships Franklin must have faced: the crushing power of the pack ice that could splinter a ship's hull like a nutshell, the months of profound darkness and cold of the polar winter, the gnawing threat of scurvy, and the disorienting endless landscape of white. For years, they found nothing. The Arctic held its secrets tightly. The searchers sailed through the same channels Franklin was presumed to have taken, but the ships and their crews seemed to have been erased from the face of the earth. It was as if they had sailed off the map and into a blank white oblivion. The first breakthrough came in the summer of a search squadron exploring the shores of Beechey Island, a small barren piece of rock at the entrance to Wellington Channel,
discovered the unmistakable signs of a wintering camp. There were the remains of a storehouse, a blacksmith's forge and a laundry. The most prominent feature was a mound of over 600 empty food tins, neatly stacked. The tins themselves were a small puzzle. They were sealed with a thick lead solder that was sloppily applied, beaded on the inside of the can as well as the out. But the overall impression was one of order and discipline. The camp had been abandoned, not overrun by disaster. The most poignant and chilling discovery lay on a small ridge overlooking the bay. 3 graves, marked with wooden headboards, their inscriptions still legible. They belonged to 3 of Franklin's crewmen, who had died during the first winter of 8. The graves were silent witnesses. They proved Franklin had been here, that the expedition had safely navigated its first winter, but they offered no clue as to where they went next. Where were the other 236 men? Why was there no message, no note left in a cairn, as was standard practice for exploring parties? The discovery at Beachy Island only deepened the mystery, providing the first act of a tragedy whose final scenes remained unknown. The key to the mystery would not be found by the Royal Navy, but by a different kind of explorer. Dr. John Rae was a tough, pragmatic Scotsman, a physician for the Hudson's Bay Company. Unlike the naval officers, Rae had spent years living in the north. He adopted the survival techniques of the indigenous peoples, learning to travel light, hunt for food, and live in snow houses. He respected the Inuit, and crucially, he listened to them. In the spring of 1854, while surveying a stretch of coastline far to the south of where the main search was concentrated, Rae encountered a group of Inuit hunters. They had a few small silver items with them, a spoon, a fork, that were immediately recognizable. They bore the crest of Sir John Franklin. Through his interpreter, Rae asked where they had gotten them. The Inuit told him a story, a disturbing and gruesome tale. Several winters before, they said a group of about 40 Kablunas, white men, had been seen dragging a large boat and sledges southwards. They were thin, their faces hollow, their steps faltering. Later that season, the hunters had come across their final camp. There were about 35 bodies, some buried in the snow, some lying in tents, others under an overturned boat. The scene, the Inuit said, was horrifying. From the mutilated state of many of the corpses and the contents of the cooking kettles, it was clear that the last survivors had resorted to the ultimate taboo. They had been eating their own dead. Rae, a careful and methodical man, purchased the silver relics and returned to London. His report, which included the Inuit testimony of cannibalism, was submitted to the Admiralty. When it was made public, it caused an explosion of outrage across Britain. The Victorian public, and the establishment, simply refused to believe it. That Royal Navy sailors, heroes of the Empire, could descend to such a level was unthinkable. It was far easier to dismiss the Inuit as untrustworthy savages, lying for profit. The novelist Charles Dickens led a public campaign to discredit Rae and defend the honor of the lost expedition, writing articles that painted the Inuit as primitive and deceitful. Lady Franklin was devastated and refused to accept the story, clinging to the hope that her husband and his men had met a more noble end. The Admiralty, considering the case closed, officially declared the crew deceased and called off the search. But Lady Franklin would not give up. She poured the last of her fortune into one final private expedition. She chose an experienced and respected Irish officer, Captain Francis Leopold McClintock, to command a small steam yacht called the Fox. His mission was not one of rescue, but of vindication. He was to find definitive proof of her husband's fate, and she hoped, to clear his name of the stain of cannibalism. In 1857, McClintock sailed for King William Island, the area identified in John Rae's report. After becoming trapped in the ice for a full year, his expedition finally began its search by sledge in the spring of 18. And there, they found the truth. His parties, fanning out across the desolate, wind-swept island, began to find relics scattered on the ground. Then they found a human skeleton, alone on the frozen plain, face down in the snow. From the tattered remains of a uniform, they identified him as a ship's steward. A few miles further on, they came upon the expedition's death boat. It was a large, heavy whaleboat, mounted on a massive, oak sled. Inside was a scene of pathetic disarray. 2 skeletons lay within the boat, and beside them a bizarre collection of objects the desperate men had chosen to drag with them: silver forks and spoons, silk handkerchiefs, scented soap, religious books and slippers. They had abandoned food and survival gear, but clung to the small comforts and symbols of the civilization they had left behind, a heartbreaking testament to their failing judgment. Then came the most important discovery of all. Near a place called Victory Point, one of McClintock's lieutenants found a large, man-made cairn of stones. Inside a small tin cylinder, he found a pre-printed Admiralty form. It was the only written record of the Franklin expedition ever recovered. On it were 2 messages. The first was dated May 1847. It was cheerful and routine. It reported that the Erebus and Terror had wintered at Beechy Island, had sailed south through the Peel and Franklin Straits, and were now wintering, trapped in the ice off the coast of King William Island. It ended with the words, "All well," but around the margins of this same piece of paper, a second, more desperate message had been scrawled, dated almost a year later, on April 25th, in a spidery, hurried hand. It told the rest of the ships had been trapped in the ice for a year and a half. 24 men had died, including Sir John Franklin himself, who had passed away on June 11th. The surviving 105 men, under the command of Captain Crozier of the Terror, were abandoning the ships the next day. They intended to march south, for the Backsfish River on the mainland. A desperate, hopeless gamble. McClintock had found the truth. The Inuit stories were not lies. The men had abandoned their ships and had died, one by one, from starvation, exposure and disease, as they made their doomed march south. The evidence of cannibalism was undeniable. He had not found the glorious end Lady Franklin had hoped for, but a grim tale of slow, agonizing death. The fate of the expedition was now known, but the reasons for the disaster remained a subject of debate. What went so wrong? Why did the best-equipped expedition in history fail so catastrophically? Modern science has provided some of the answers. Analysis of the bones of the crew members found by McClintock revealed extremely high concentrations of lead. The source was almost certainly the thousands of tin provisions. The cans were sealed by a contractor who had worked hastily, allowing thick seams of lead solder to come into direct contact with the food. Over 3 years the men would have slowly poisoned themselves. Chronic lead poisoning would have caused severe physical weakness, paranoia, cognitive decline, and madness, explaining their inability to hunt or make rational survival decisions. They were dying long before they starved. For over a century the story ended there, but the greatest mystery remained. Where were the ships? Then in 2014, the puzzle's largest piece fell into place. A Canadian underwater archaeology team, guided by modern technology, and critically by generations of carefully preserved Inuit oral history, found a wreck in the southern waters of Queen Maud Gulf. It was HMS Erebus, sitting upright on the seabed, in remarkably good condition. 2 years later, acting on a tip from an Inuk ranger, the team found the second ship. HMS Terror was discovered in a bay further north, in pristine condition, looking as if it could set sail tomorrow, its windows unbroken, its cabins intact. The discoveries confirmed the accuracy of the Inuit knowledge that had been dismissed for so long. They opened a new, astonishing chapter in the story, allowing historians and archaeologists to look directly into the world of the lost crew. The story of the Franklin expedition is a cautionary tale about the clash between imperial ambition and the unforgiving power of nature, between technology and the elemental forces of the world. It is the story of 1,209 men who sailed into a white, silent world, confident in their own invincibility, only to be consumed by it, leaving behind a haunting mystery that has captivated and horrified us for generations.
It began as a whisper, a rumor carried on the wind along the great arteries of trade that connected worlds. For centuries, the Silk Road had been a conduit for shimmering fabrics, exotic spices, and precious ideas. But in the middle of the 14th century, it began to carry something else. From the vast, arid steppes of Central Asia, where it lived as a quiet sickness among the marmot populations, a hidden killer began to stir. It traveled in the blood of fleas, which in turn traveled in the fur of the black rat, a creature that had become man's constant, unseen companion. The first major eruption into the consciousness of the West occurred at the edge of the Black Sea, at the Genoese trading port of Kaffa, in the Crimea. In 1346 the city was under siege by a Mongol army. The siege was long and frustrating for the attackers, and then their own ranks began to sicken and die from a mysterious pestilence. In an act of biological warfare that was both desperate and diabolically inspired, the Mongol commander ordered the corpses of his plague victims to be loaded onto catapults. The decaying bodies were hurled over the city walls, arcing through the sky before crashing into the streets within. The defenders, horrified, threw the bodies back into the sea, but it was too late. The air was tainted, the water was poisoned, and the invisible enemy was now inside the gates. The Genoese merchants, seeing the city was lost, fled to their galleys. They abandoned the port, setting sail for home, for the safety of Italy. They did not know that they were carrying the apocalypse with them. Their ships were not sanctuaries, they were floating coffins. The rats in their holds were infected, and the fleas in the cargo and the clothes of the sailors were already spreading their deadly contagion. One by one, the sailors began to fall ill, overcome by a raging fever, racking pains, and the terrifying sign of the disease, the dark swollen lumps that appeared in their armpits, necks and groins. These were the buboes, the tokens of a swift and agonizing death. In October of 1347, A convoy of 12 Genoese ships drifted into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. The scene that greeted the port officials was one from a nightmare. The decks were littered with the dead and dying. The few sailors still able to stand were delirious, spectral figures covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, in a panic, ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but the damage was done. The rats scurried down the mooring ropes. The fleas leaped ashore. The great pestilence had arrived in Europe. From Messina, it spread with terrifying speed. It moved not at the pace of an army, but at the speed of trade. Every ship that left an infected port carried the seeds of the plague to a new one. It reached Genoa and Venice in the north of Italy soon after, and from these great commercial hubs, it exploded across the continent. It moved up the river valleys, along the pilgrim trails and trade. By the end of 1348, it had engulfed France, Spain, and had crossed the Channel into England. By 1349 it was ravaging Germany and Scandinavia. No barrier, natural or man-made, seemed to slow its advance. It was a silent, invisible tide of death that washed over the entire known world. The people of medieval Europe had no concept of germs or contagion in the modern sense. Their medical understanding was based on the ancient Greek theory of humors, the belief that health depended on the balance of 4 essential fluids in the body. They believed the plague was a miasma, a form of corrupt or bad air, perhaps released by earthquakes, or caused by an unfortunate alignment of the planets. They saw it as a divine judgment, a punishment from a wrathful God for the sins of mankind. The physicians of the day were powerless. They tried what they could, their efforts a tragic mixture of folk remedies and flawed medical theory. They lanced the buboes, hoping to release the poison, a procedure that was excruciatingly painful and almost always fatal. They prescribed potions made of crushed emeralds, ground unicorn horn, or arsenic. They practiced bloodletting to rebalance the body's humors, further weakening the afflicted. Some doctors, seeing the futility of their efforts, refused to treat the sick. Others, more courageous, donned strange and terrifying costumes. They wore long waxed leather gowns, gloves and a mask with a long bird-like beak. The beak was filled with aromatic herbs, spices and flowers, intended to filter out the deadly miasma. This image of the plague doctor, a figure somewhere between a physician and a specter of death, became an enduring symbol of the terror. The disease manifested in 3 horrifying forms. The most common was the bubonic plague, named for the grotesque swelling. Its onset was sudden, a high fever, vomiting, and extreme pain, followed by the appearance of the buboes. Death usually followed within a week. Even more deadly was the pneumonic plague, which attacked the lung. It was spread through the air, by coughing, and it killed with ruthless efficiency, often within 2 days. The third form, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream direct. It caused high fever and a dramatic darkening of the skin as the blood vessels hemorrhaged, which is what gave the pestilence its most famous name, the Black Death. This form was universally fatal, sometimes killing its victim within hours of the first symptom. As the plague advanced, the very fabric of society began to unravel. The bonds of family and community, once the bedrock of medieval life, disintegrated in the face of fear. The Florentine writer Giovanni Boccaccio, a survivor of the plague, wrote a chilling account of the breakdown in his city. He described how healthy people avoided the sick at all costs. Brother abandoned brother, wives fled from their husbands, and most terribly, parents refused to nurse their own children, leaving them to die alone. They were, he wrote, like creatures that did not belong to them. The wealthy fled the crowded pestilential cities for their isolated country estates, hoping to outrun the miasma. The poor, with nowhere to go, were trapped. Law and order collapsed. Notaries and lawyers died, leaving wills unwritten and disputes unsettled. The rhythms of daily life ceased. Shops closed, workshops fell silent, and fields went unplowed. The only booming trade was that of the grave diggers. At first the dead were given Christian burials, but the cemeteries quickly filled. The authorities designated fields outside the city walls for mass graves. Huge trenches, the plague pits, were dug. At night, carts would trundle through the empty streets, the carters crying out, "Bring out your dead." Bodies were collected from houses, often entire families at once, and loaded onto the carts like so much cordwood. They were taken to the pits and layered, one on top of the other, with a thin sprinkling of earth in between, like lasagna, as one chronicler grimly put it. The sacred rituals that had guided human life from cradle to grave, for centuries, were abandoned in the face of overwhelming death. In the midst of this apocalypse, human nature revealed its extremes. Some, believing the end of the world was at hand, gave themselves over to a desperate hedonism. They broke into the abandoned homes of the wealthy, feasting on their food, drinking their wine, and indulging in every vice, living in a constant drunken party until the plague claimed them too.
Others ran to the opposite extreme, embracing a fervent and often fanatical piety. The most dramatic manifestation of this was the flagellant movement. Processions of men, stripped to the waist, marched from town to town, their faces hidden by hoods. For 33.5 days, a number symbolizing Christ's years on earth, they would gather in the public square twice a day, and whip themselves with leather scourges tipped with iron spikes. As they beat their own backs into a bloody pulp, they would sing mournful hymns and beg God to lift his punishment from the world. At first the flagellants were welcomed as holy men, their public penance a source of awe and comfort for the terrified populace. But the movement soon took on a darker, more dangerous character. They claimed to be able to forgive sins, directly challenging the authority of the church. They grew increasingly hysterical and violent, and they became a force of disorder, often spreading the plague themselves as they moved from town to town. Eventually, the Pope condemned them as heretics, and the movement was suppressed. When reason and faith both fail, fear often seeks a scapegoat. In many parts of Europe, especially in Germany and France, the terror and confusion found an outlet in a wave of horrific violence against Jewish community. The old, poisonous lie that Jews were enemies of Christendom resurfaced in a new and deadly form. They were accused of causing the plague by deliberately poisoning the wells and rivers. It was a baseless and irrational accusation, often refuted by the Pope himself, who pointed out that Jews were dying from the plague at the same rate as Christians. But logic was no defense against mass hysteria. Driven by fear, greed for Jewish property, and centuries of religious prejudice, mobs attacked Jewish quarters across Europe. Entire communities were annihilated. In cities like Strasbourg, Mainz and Cologne, thousands of Jewish men, women and children were rounded up and burned alive. They were given the choice between conversion to Christianity and death. The vast majority chose death, a final tragic testament to their faith in the face of incomprehensible hatred. Between 1347 and 1351, the Great Pestilence raged. Then, as mysteriously as it had arrived, it began to recede. It did not disappear entirely. It would return in smaller, less virulent waves for centuries. But the first, overwhelming tide of death was over. Europe emerged blinking into the sunlight, a continent depopulated, and profoundly traumatized. The demographic toll was staggering. While precise figures are impossible to know, modern historians estimate that the Black Death killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. In some regions, the toll may have been as high as 60%. The world was emptier, quieter and forever changed. The consequences of this cataclysm were immense and transformative. The very foundations of the medieval world had been shaken. The feudal system, which relied on a large peasant population tied to the land, was dealt a fatal blow. With the massive labor shortage, the surviving peasants were for the first time in a position of power. They could demand higher wages, better conditions, and greater freedom. When the nobility tried to reimpose the old order, it sparked a series of peasant revolts across Europe. Serfdom, the institution that had defined the medieval economy for centuries, began to crumble. The authority of the church, which had been unable to explain, prevent or even offer comfort during the plague, was severely weakened. The faith of ordinary people was not necessarily diminished, but their confidence in the earthly institution of the church was shaken. This questioning of religious authority helped to sow the seeds that would, more than a century later, blossom into the Protestant Reformation. Art and culture became saturated with a new, morbid sensibility. The theme of the Dîme Macabre, the dance of death, appeared in frescoes and woodcuts across Europe. In these images, skeletons, representing death, are shown gleefully leading people from all walks of life, popes, kings, knights and peasants, in a final democratic dance to the grave. It was a stark reminder that death was the ultimate leveler, that no amount of wealth or power could save one from its grasp. In the end, the Black Death was more than just a tragedy, it was a crucible. It was an agent of violent, rapid change that brought the medieval era to a shuddering close. By clearing away the old structures and certainties, it inadvertently created the space for something new to grow. The survivors of the plague inherited a world of unprecedented opportunity. The redistribution of wealth, the new social mobility, and the psychological shift towards a more secular, human-centered worldview were all factors that helped to fuel the cultural and intellectual explosion of the Renaissance. The Black Death was the dark night of the soul for an entire civilization, but from that darkness came the dawn of the modern world, a world built upon the ashes of the old, forever marked by the memory of the great mortality.